Hello, my name is Rex Holland, and I'm here to present my senior capstone, The History and Origin of the English Language. My essential question was, how has the English language changed, and what happened up to this point to change it? I asked this question at the beginning of the year, and I spent the rest of the year trying to answer this question. Why did I choose this topic? Well, first of all, I am a native English speaker. I have always been a native English speaker, and I most likely will always be a native English speaker, regardless of whatever other languages I learn over the course of my life. The second reason is I've always been interested in history ever since I was 5. My first part of history that I liked learning about was Egypt, ancient Egypt specifically. I think, ancient Egypt. And I did actually have a lot of stuff related to ancient Egypt. I even had a birthday party that was Egyptian themed. So a lot of people went to it. And, I actually had a paper mache bust of an ancient pharaoh that I gifted to Miss McDonough. So yeah, that was pretty cool. My last and final reason for getting into this is a game called Crusader Kings 2, where you simulate Mark, and you have to obtain and maintain power. It's a grand strategy game that takes place between the years 769 to 1453. So, this game, the reason why it's so interesting is, or why it got me interested in learning about English, is because one of the possible ways you can play is playing William the Conqueror, and after 100 years of ruling over the lands, the Anglo-Saxon parts of English would turn into English. If they were ruled by a Norman king after the year 1100. Now, that game had a lot of flaws, as in it was very ahistorical, such as, for example, you could marry a horse, you could reform a pagan religion, your cousin could be a bear, and you just didn't notice. So, yeah, there's a lot left to be desired. My only hope is that the third game makes improvements on that front. My mentor is Abby Crocker. She used to be a student at Halldale. She has a master's degree in folklore studies, and a bachelor's in history and creative writing. I met her because one of my teachers helped me introduce her to her, as I had trouble finding a mentor. Because the only ones I could find was a Civil War historian, and a lot of them didn't respond to my emails. My field work consisted of reading whatever material that my mentor provided to me, and also listening to the History of English podcast, a source that's a really good source that my mentor suggested to me, where a linguist basically makes a monthly episode on every minor change in the English language. I spent a lot of time on Sugarloaf and the Cafe. I don't have pictures of that. I also spent a lot of time in my homeroom, which my homeroom teacher, Miss McFarland, really encouraged me to do work. And I used to kind of like always sit in this chair. I made a recreation. This isn't actually what it looks like. I used to, well, dress a lot differently, but this is just an example of what it looked like when I was studying in my favorite chair. Part 2. The early Anglo-Saxon period started at the year 400 and ended at the year 600. It started when the Anglo-Saxons started invading England and kind of like displacing the kind of like the Britons, which is kind of like the original inhabitants of England, and they were kind of like pushed out by the Anglo-Saxons. Major reason for this was that Rome abandoned England because they no longer could defend it because their empire was slowly collapsing. And yeah, basically the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and the Frisians all kind of like moved into England. And because of how similar their dialects were, they were able to communicate with each other, so they were able to form kingdoms that could, well, they didn't constantly go to war with each other. Or maybe they did, perhaps. At one point, I tried to learn Old English, but it was really hard because it has a completely different grammar structure to regular English. And, yeah, it was, well, really hard to learn because it has a completely different syntax. Like, for example, a sentence like, a man gave a dog a stone makes sense in English. And, kind of like the opposite of the sentence, the man gave the stone a dog doesn't really make as much sense. But if you said the same sentence in Old English, it would mean the exact same thing because of how it's structured. So it's very different from modern English. I got some videos of what the language sounded like. I'm going to use it on my school computer because it's a lot easier to kind of like load. Just give me a sec. I guess I could tell you some fun facts while I'm waiting for the video. You know, like that ye old tavern kind of like thing that you always see in like shows and stuff? It's actually because like originally was the letter thorn, which represented like the TH, and kind of like they when they sent it off to like the printing presses, which were majorly in Germany, they didn't really have the letter thorn in their language, so they just used whatever was the closest, which was Y. So it's still pronounced the old tavern, but it looks like ye old tavern. Okay, so finally got the video. Just gotta make sure there's not an ad.
Writing's not that.
Yeah, there is an ad. Just, yeah. Sorry if this is really boring. So, I hate when that happens.
It's Wittgesauer.
Okay, so that was from the TV series Vikings, where a bunch of kind of like Anglo-Saxon priests are talking to each other. Now, what I'm hoping that you heard is some familiar words. That's because technically Old English is still English. It's just missing a lot of what modern English kind of like had. Now the next video is going to be both Old English and Middle English. Good thing there is no ad on this video. Good. Okay.
My name is Arthur Barr. I'm an associate professor of literature at MIT. I'm a medievalist, and I'm going to read the first 12 lines of Beowulf in Old English. What, way Gardena, in yer dagum, theod kuninga, thrum je frunon, hutha athelingas, ellen fremedon, oft shuld cheving, shaden a thratum, monagum machtham, med a settler oft tach, exoda erlas, suthan arest worth, fair shaft funden. Heithas frovra je bad, works under walknum, werth mundum thach, of at him aya hulch, thara situndra, of her hron rada, Huron shoulder, gomban yuldan. That was god kinning. And I'm going to read the first stanza of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in the original Middle English. Sithen the sage and the assault was saced at Troy, the Borg Britned and Brent to Brondus and Oscus, the tulk that the Tromus of treason there wrought was treated for his treachery, the truest on eartha. It was Ennius the Arthel and his he a kinda, that sithen to praesed provinces and patronus become, well nech of all the whale in the West Elis. For richer Romulus to Roma, riches him swether, with great Babonsa that bore Hebius upon first, on Nevinus it his own Norma, as it knew hot. Tisius to Tuscan and Teldus beginnus, Langaberd in Lombardy and Liftus Upomus, on fair over the French flowed Felix Brutus, on Moniboncus full broda, Bretagne he setus, with wind, where wear and rock and wonder be seethus as wont therein, and oft both bliss and blunder, full skate has skifted sin.
Okay, so that was a guy reading in two texts, as he explained, both from different periods of history. You could probably also tell how both languages, even though they sound a lot different, they're still English, so there's still a couple words that you recognize in both of them. You could probably take a wild guess of what's happening. The next slide is the origin of the word England, which derives from the word Angleland, or land of the Angles. Another thing was that the word Welsh is an old Germanic word for foreigner, back when all the Germanic peoples used to live in what is now northern Germany and parts of northern Poland. And kind of like Celts used to be over here, with like one of the most famous ones being like Gaul. But basically some of the Germanics moved to England as well when the Roman Empire was starting to collapse. Well, not really, actually, yeah, collapse. Christianization of England in the kind of like the late 6th century. They sent missions to the Kingdom of Kent. It was kind of like started by a guy named Saint Gregory. Basically, he saw a couple boys kind of like being sold at the marketplace in Rome. He basically asked if they were Christians or not, and he was disappointed to hear that they weren't. And I have a quote from him. Okay. I found this a lot more easily than I expected. Okay. Alas, that the author of darkness should have men so bright in face in his grip, and that minds devoid of inward grace should bear so graceful an outward form. So he basically, this was kind of like the event that kicked off his goal to Christianize England. Before that, the Anglo-Saxons were pagan, but they worshipped a similar religion to Norse pagan. But, for example, they would, instead of pronouncing Odin, which is the leader of the gods, it would be Hodin. So, yeah, they had different names, so they were functionally the same religion. The Middle Anglo-Saxon period is kind of like when Anglo-Saxons were not really unified under one flag. They had like a bunch of different kingdoms, and kind of like the kingdoms. Well, they were invaded by Vikings later on, but there's the kingdom of Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, and the one I mentioned before, Kent, with two lesser kingdoms, Sussex and Essex. Yeah, they would later be invaded by the by the Vikings, not the Dikings. Those people don't exist. They formed a country called the Danelaw, or a kingdom, which took parts of Northumbria, East Anglia, and half of Mercia, and also Essex. But, no one really cares about Essex. The Norse, when they came to England, they settled. They intermarried with the local Anglo-Saxon population. They passed on some of their names for towns, villages, like kind of like counties, titles, surnames. Like, for example, they introduced an entire new surname type, kind of like the surname type of son, like Simpson, Thompson, and Johnson, which would basically is just derived from how the Vikings, instead of using a regular surname, they would name themselves like, my father was Tom, therefore I'm Sven Thompson, instead of, for example, something like Sven Clark. He would say I'm Sven Thompson, as like son of Tom. The unification of England happened in 954 after the King of Wessex killed the King of York, Eric. It wasn't like they just had like a duel and the winner got to like form England. It was more like the Kingdom of Wessex gradually fought and reclaimed land from the Danelaw starting in the 910s. And by 954, all they had to do was win one war to unify England. And this was like the first time where England would be a unified country instead of just a bunch of like kingdoms. Well, actually, I think the Romans unified England, but that doesn't really count because, you know, they're an empire. Late Anglo-Saxon period. I call this the late Anglo-Saxon period since it's the last period in which the Anglo-Saxons exist. The Anglo-Saxon period, kind of like they had Anglo-Saxons had 100 years of ruling themselves until this guy named William the Conqueror had a claim on Harold Godwinson's throne, which was like William, the previous King of England, promised him that he was going to be the King of England, but Harold Godwinson said, "No way, Jose, I was related to the guy." So William got permission from the Pope to beat up Harold until he gave him what was rightfully his. Or at least that's how history portrays it. which, for all we know, could be correct or incorrect. No one knows. But there's also a third contender, Harold Hardrada. I'm just going to call him Viking Harold. He was considered to be the last Viking king, despite being a Catholic. But he died. He died in battle to Harold Godwinson. And basically, while Harold was celebrating, William attacked them from the south, won one battle, and pretty much won the war because Harold died. Some accounts say that Harold died through an arrow in the eye, but no one knows for sure. But yeah, that would start a whole thing where then for the next couple hundred years, French would be the dominant language in the English aristocracy because William kicked out all of Harold's old vassals, whether or not they agreed with him or not. And yeah, just put in his friends and people that were loyal to him instead, which yeah, basically made French the dominant language of the aristocracy. Basically, that meant that a bunch of new French words were introduced. Now, the reason why I selected 1150 for the kind of like beginning of the Middle English period was because that's actually when people started speaking Middle English, which is what you heard before. But basically, 100 Years' War happened in 1387, and yeah, that pretty much changed a lot of things. But during this period, there was also one of the most famous Middle English poems, and also the Lollard heresy was on the rise. So, yeah. The 100 Years' War was not 100 years of constant fighting. It was more like fighting for a couple of years, peace for 10, then after those 10 years were up, fighting again. Basically, kept fighting until 1453, and eventually, at one point, England controlled half of France. So, yeah, but at the end of the war, England controlled none of France. And they were so bitter against each other after the war that French got eviscerated in England. Like, no one was speaking it anymore because they hated the French so much. Because, you know, they've been at semi-constant warfare for 116 years. And this was all because the King of England had a claim, because his mother was French, that he should be the King of France as well. Well, technically, at this time, the King of England technically was French. What I'm saying is that his mom was part of the French royalty. The Wycliffe Bible was created by John Wycliffe. Basically, he was kind of like a priest. He and a bunch of scribes created a translation of the Bible into Middle English. And basically, the reason why he created it was because he disagreed with the concept that there should be a pope. Like, he basically cited that there was no pope mentioned in the Bible, therefore there should be no pope. It was the base of the Lollard heresy, which followed in his beliefs. And he introduced a lot of Latin terms into the English language using this Bible. But a lot of his not a lot, as in like a majority, as in like a significant amount of his followers disagreed with using Latin words, so they decided to make their own Bible, but only using Anglo-Saxon based words. So, yeah. The Canterbury Tales were also pretty important. They were started in 1387, and they were last added on to in 1400 because writer died. He died before it was completed. If it was finished, it probably wouldn't be considered a poem. But it was basically created because there was a demand by the middle class of England at the time, who were literate, to have a form of entertainment that wasn't just going to the pub. So, yeah. Might as well give you a short summary of the book. Basically, pilgrims go to Canterbury, which is a kind of like a place in Kent, and they basically have a storytelling contest where they all tell stories, and there's 20 of them. A lot of them are comedies. But it's supposed to give an insight on different people of England living at the time, such as they were both like rich and poor, vulgar, which at the time meant like common, and kind of like aristocracy, as in like they used French words to describe kind of like features of the non-lower classes of like the storytellers. Early modern English period. 1453 isn't considered to be the early modern period, not because like the 100 Years' War ended. That's actually a complete coincidence. It's actually considered to be the early modern period because of the fall of Constantinople. And Constantinople was last remnants of the Roman Empire, which did actually exist in the kind of like medieval period, but people call it the Byzantine Empire. They didn't consider themselves like anything different. They considered themselves Romans. So yeah, Shakespeare started this period by creating 2,000 words and a lot of plays, both historical, comedies, and dramas. Also, early colonization made it so that English was spoken on more than one continent. And also, Isaac Newton came a couple hundred, I mean literally like 200 years later, and created a myriad of scientific terms where instead they just used Latin, but they actually created human terms. Shakespeare, as I said, created 2,000 words. He also wrote some historical plays, created a lot of terms as well. He basically, as I said, created 2,000 words. It's not known if he created all of them himself or just wrote down a bunch that other people were saying. But honestly, I'm kind of glad that he did write them down, because if he didn't, if they were said by other people, I mean, we wouldn't have access to those terms existing. So the really good ones we wouldn't know about. But he also made it so that English was thought, and it could be thought of as a poetic language. Since, he basically showed the potential of it. Standardization of English. The first English dictionary was created in 1755. The Oxford Dictionary was created in 1857. They started in 1857, and they're still working today. Yeah. Sorry about that. So many new English words are created that if there wasn't a dictionary, instead of saying, oh, you're speaking American English, you'd probably just be speaking American, since it would just devolve into its own language. The same with any other continent, really. That's what happens when there is no standardization, and standardization is most likely why we can actually understand texts from 1857. Since before, it would be like, wow, I don't understand what any of this means. But language still evolves regardless of standardization. I'm saying it just evolves slower. Part 3. My major setbacks include the fact that pandemic happened. That kind of, I think, affected everyone. No one expected that coming. But I am glad because one of my alternate choices for my capstone was West Virginian folklore. And at this time of year, I would have been not been able to actually go to West Virginia since the whole plan was to go there during spring break to actually meet up with people after studying it for a while. So I'm kind of glad I chose this one, not because it's objectively better, but more because it's more convenient based on the events that happened. I forgot to take photos of all of the places where I studied. I did make one recreation. I did not actually dress in pajamas when I listened to that podcast. Also historical satire isn't really funny anymore. It's kind of like learning that the Vikings didn't actually have horns. Just like whenever you see Vikings with horns, you kind of just groan to yourself because you know that's not what Vikings looked like. Except, imagine that, except it's like peasants thinking that the earth